Introduction to comparative government. The first portion of this slideshow is the Pepsi challenge. We might be able to get to this in class, but we're talking about how in comparative we're always comparing countries, different systems of government. So this activity is kind of look at the different pops or sodas, and if you're able to identify them. Again, comparatives don't just sip nations, so we have to resist making statements like Russia is a democracy now because the Soviets have lost power. Well, what does that mean? Um, is it a true democracy? Is it completely because the Soviets lost power? Who's in control? Or like Iran, Mexico, Russia, Nigeria, all very similar countries because they have a president. Is that really true now? Again, comparatives don't sip. The U.S. is the best healthcare system in the world. That's a very broad statement. Comparatives want to look at things like how is it financed? What does it cost? Who gets it? All those different things before they make any judgments. So, comparative government part one here. A couple definitions. What is government? Leadership and the institutions that make the policies. Compared to politics, which is the power to actually make those decisions. And then we're going to look at how is power maintained, how is it gained throughout each country. Comparative politics, the definition is field within political science that focuses on domestic politics and analyzes patterns of similarities and differences. The difference between international relations and comparative politics there then is that international relations is looking at all the foreign policies and your conflicts and your international organizations that work with those countries. However, in comparative politics, we're looking at the election systems. You're looking at all their different parties and their party systems, whether it's a one party, a multi-party. You're looking at their executive and legislative branches and how they operate, the interest groups that are made up in that country and the bureaucracies that run the country. Some questions that we ask in comparative politics, again, who rules? Why are some countries more prosperous than the others? Maybe explain some political behaviors as well. So the 6 countries that we're going to look at, obviously we're going to look at key concepts in this first unit, and we're going to go throughout those in the 6 different countries, look at their institutions, policies, and any important events. You're going to look at the UK, you're going to look at Russia, China, Mexico, Iran, and Nigeria. Again, we're going to look at similarities and differences. Why do we compare? We want to understand how the nations work and what are the differences between different presidential systems or parliamentary systems. We can evaluate their decision making and their structures of government. Different ways to compare. You're going to look at empirical data or empirical statements, which are statements based on facts, numbers, stats. You can draw it from data, whereas normative issues or normative statements you can draw on different judgments. You're judging something, for example, like the United States has the best healthcare system, or you could have an empirical statement that discusses so many people are insured under Obamacare. You have a stat there, that'd be an empirical statement. We look at the scientific method. There's hypothesis. You speculate and make statements. You have independent and dependent variables. So why is education dependent on the amount of money that people have? And then you look at, is there a correlation between that? Is there a relationship that exists when a change in one variable accompanies a change in the other? So here's another example. Why are poverty rates higher in one country than in others? Your hypothesis, poverty level might be caused by low levels of formal education. So again, you want to look at what is your independent variable, the independent variable being the level of education. The dependent variable would be the poverty level. So throughout comparative government, there's been different approaches. The first approach, the old approach, was the three worlds approach until about the 1990s, where they said, Okay, there was the United States and its allies, and there's the Soviet Union and its allies, and then what they called the third world nation. So any country that was economically deprived and underdeveloped. Newer approaches kind of look at democracy versus authoritarian, which is a political way to look at it, or maybe they would look at communism and capitalism, the economic way to look at it. The new approaches take into account informal politics. They look at civil society, how interest groups are formed, so citizens that are operating to affect change in the government. Again, it's no longer dominated just by the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States. The approach now, countries kind of fall into three different categories. You have the advanced democracies, well-established governments, high-level economic development. Your examples here would be the UK and the US. You have communist and post-communist countries. Some of their individuals, their freedoms are limited in those countries. The wealth is divided somewhat equally, more equally. Your examples there would be China and Russia. And other countries that we have are your less developed and your newly industrialized countries. Newly industrialized, they have expansion, growth, somewhat rapid, leaning towards democracy, trying to have some social and political stability. That'd be more Mexico and Iran. Where then you have your less developed countries, you have significant economic development, often fall into authoritarian governments. So your example in our 6 countries would be Nigeria. Now, as I introduce this, I want to also point out what the test looks like. Again, here's the planning report. The global mean is always less than half of the max possible score for this test. So you don't really need to be perfect, you just got to get half the points. The exam is 2 hours and 25 minutes. 50% of your exam scores on your multiple choice. There are 55 multiple choice questions. The FRQs will look a little different than the AP US, where there are 5 short answer questions, 1 concept analysis. So you're going to look at a certain concept and now analyze it, look at it in different viewpoints, and then there's 2 country contexts. And the country context questions, you're really comparing 2 countries and most likely a different or a form of political system. So maybe their legislature, their election systems. Here's an example of a short answer. Explain how 2 current environmental problems in China resulted from its economic liberalization. Describe 1 policy the Chinese government has developed in response to one of these environmental problems. Conceptual analysis. This is where you're going to get your A, B, C, and D questions. Many of the countries covered in the AP Comparative Government and Politics course are multi-nation states. So then you have to define one thing. You define the concept of a state that we'll learn about. You can explain how a nation is different than a state. Describe a challenge governments face in securing stability in multi-nation states. And then discuss 2 policies that governments have taken to address the challenges you described in C. And the last one here, your country context. They have 2 countries here, China and Mexico, have significant geographic patterns of internal migrations of people over the last 20 years. And then they give you A, B, C, and D, consequences, pressures, things like that. That is the first part of the intro to comparative government.